This is Tim.
And this is Brandon.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Talk about Adastra in Africa. This is by Barry Windsor Smith, published by Fantagraphics. And this is, what was the date on this? It's not such a new book.
This edition was published in April of 1999. But it is a story that was retold from an earlier story that Marvel did not want to publish. Mm-hmm. But I don't know what year that was from. 1997?
By the way, this was in Mulele's box of comics that we went through a while back. And we talked about it a little bit on that podcast about some of the storytelling techniques in here. Yeah, it was originally written to be a story about Storm from the X-Men, but yeah, Marvel didn't want to publish it, and so Barry Windsor Smith sort of he wanted to use the story, and he used this other character, Adastra, who is a kind of a goddess, I guess. It's from some other publisher's sort of universe. I read this a couple weeks ago. I don't remember exactly what it said, but what's sort of odd about it is that at the end there's sort of a faked up supposed interview with Adastra, and I could see from that really the way Adastra acts and talks in the story is not really how the character Adastra is. And in fact, she talks in the interview about being like 8 feet tall or something? Much taller than the Adastra in the story. I mean, it's really Storm, or it's kind of like Adastra acting like Storm in the story.
Adastra is very brash and somewhat arrogant. Uh-huh. Where the Storm character that's in the story doesn't come across that way at all to me.
Yeah, I mean, it really feels like Storm, who just looks a little bit different.
Well, I said this before. I don't even think she looks any different, because when Barry Windsor Smith was drawing Storm in the 80s,
maybe
around the time of the Mutant Massacre, she looked exactly like this. Some of the panels they look a little bit different, but for the most part, this is the way he would have drawn her. This face looks different. This face looks exactly how he would have had her face in the X-Men. X-Men. So maybe like a panel here or a panel there he filled in and it looks like a different person, but for the most part it does look like Storm, the Mohawk Storm from the 80s.
Yeah, Adastra in the story does have a mohawk. And and the story of course takes place in Africa. And it's Storm or Adastra or whoever she is with some native people in Africa, and I didn't have very high expectations for the story, and they were not exceeded. The story was just kind of there for me.
It seemed like I know Barry Windsor Smith thought it was such a great story, but it just seemed like all the other stories that were about Storm in the past.
About Storm being in Africa and kind of making rain fall for the natives and
being worshipped as a goddess.
Yeah.
The art is beautiful. His storytelling, as far as panel to panel, I think is pretty good. But the story was just kind of bleh.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what it was that he particularly liked about the story. Well, he wrote it, of course. So.
Well, I'm wondering if it was the artwork that he liked.
Well, that could be.
Because if he had actually...
This was both written and drawn by him, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, if this was the exact artwork that he did for the Storm story, then I wouldn't blame him for wanting to try to get it published somewhere.
Because he's already done the work, and it's great, beautiful work. It's just, maybe he was just looking at the writing as kind of being a vehicle for all this work that he had already done.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have too much to say about it.
Yeah.
I think it's beautiful in a very aesthetic way, not very deep.
Mm-hmm.
The writing, the story isn't very engaging at all.
Mm-hmm.
He's got some points where he's talking about life and death, but to me it's not anything new or interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, it might be worth a look for the art, but the story was not.
Yeah, there are a couple panels that are just gorgeous. He's got a lot of detail in there, and the brushwork, the inking is beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it doesn't fill both sides of what I think is essential for a good comic book. Art and writing.
In the Mulele's Box of Comics podcast, we talked about how there are a few places in this book where a scene is broken up into panels in order to show some movement. Like I'm looking at one page where there are 3 vertical panels side by side showing one scene, and something is zipping across the top of the page. It's a little unclear to me what it is. It's not her. Is it like lightning or... But lightning doesn't go horizontal. But something seems to be zipping out of the trees on the left and moving off to the right.
I thought it might just be like, you know, sometimes we get a light effect in a movie, and even though like I was thinking that a bolt of lightning had struck the tree, and kind of the effect was that it spread across those other panels.
Yeah, looking at the pages before, it seems like something... What's happening here? Is something like exploding out of the tree, or is the tree exploding out of the ground? And she seems to be... I think she's trying to revive the shaman who had died, and he does. Might as well spoil it. He does reappear at the end of the story. Although it's not, you know, he didn't actually come back to life. It's kind of his spirit. Yeah, I mean, this tree seems to be rapidly growing and making sounds, making crunch, crack. And so, I guess it seems to be just a beam of light that's coming out horizontally so that it will cross the panels. There are some other beams of light coming out in other directions, but for some reason that one is much longer than the others. But and as far as and then he even has the sound effects crossing between the panels. So that was something I found a little interesting about this book, how he fits the sound effects into the scenes. There's at least one place where, see if I can find that, where the sound effects were passing behind characters or behind the scene. Yeah, I'm looking at, these pages don't have numbers, but there's a page here where they're calling out her name, Adastra, and we're in one of the places where it says Adastra, she's in front of it. She's blocking out the S. And another place where they're guys clicking like drumsticks together, and the sound effect is behind the sticks, which I think is kind of interesting. It gives it kind of a three-dimensional feeling, the depth, and the sound effects aren't blocking out the scene, and it kind of shows that the sound is coming from behind in some cases. I don't know, it was an interesting way to do it, I thought. But I guess there's not too much more to say about that.
Since you were talking about the sound effects, I can start to get into one of the other books that we were going to talk about today.
Okay.
I brought in the DC Comics Guide to Coloring and Lettering, and putting sound effects, their placement on the page, bubbles, and their placement on the page, whether you want the characters in front or behind the bubbles. They go into a lot of the theory with this book.
Mm-hmm.
DC's Guide to Coloring and Lettering Comics is, in my opinion, one of the best guides out there as far as telling you what coloring is and how to do it, and then lettering and the theory behind it, and how to do it both mechanically and digitally.
Mm-hmm.
So is it okay if we transition into this?
Sure.
This? Yeah? Because that really wasn't all that interesting. And this book is much more interesting. This is part of a series, and the entire series is really good. I'll probably be talking about some of the other books in the series. What I really liked about this book is it isn't just a surface level, okay, step 1, step 2, step 3, this is what I do as an artist. It actually goes into the theory so that you can understand it as well as apply the techniques that they're using. They show you in both of these the techniques that you need to use to do it more of a traditional way, and then how to do it digitally. Primarily the focus is digital, because that's the way most comics are colored, and most comics are lettered nowadays. I think, I don't know if I lent you this one to read.
I don't think I've seen this, no.
But I think this is, if you could pick one book to learn how to color or to learn how to letter, you get the bonus because they're both in the same book, but this would be my choice. I've got a couple other books. They call me the librarian for some reason. I don't know exactly why. But I've got a couple other books on lettering. One is from Comic Craft, and I've got a bunch of other books on digital pre-press stuff like coloring, and some of it has lettering in it. But those other books are not nearly as good as this book is. The guy who wrote it, Mark Chiarello and Todd Klein, both very systematic with their approach, and they cover everything that you would possibly need to know about coloring. Not just, okay, if you get into Photoshop, you're going to see a palette on the side, and then you choose a color and then fill it in over here, right? Which would be perhaps the approach that I've seen in other books, and a lot of professionals may choose to do. Because when you're actually coloring, a lot of people aren't actually thinking about color theory or where I should have a highlight or where I should have a shadow. They're just kind of thinking, well, what will be pretty? What kind of colors do I feel like putting into this panel? Where this has specific examples, and especially for color theory, they give you an example that has been altered. So you have one with the applied technique that they're talking about, and one without.
Is that a Mignola?
This is Mignola.
Who is that character?
That's Deadman.
Deadman, yeah.
And this is on page 31. It has 2 panels, both exactly the same panel, colored slightly differently. It says, a clean minimal art style calls for a clean minimal color job. In panel 1, Mike Mignola's graphic drawing style has been over-rendered and over-modeled. The second panel shows a simpler, cleaner approach to coloring, which is more appropriate for this type of artwork. And I wish more people knew that, because there are so many comic books out there, probably more so in Marvel. I don't read very much DC, but more so in Marvel. They have somebody who's a really good inker, somebody who's a really good penciler, but they have a colorist going there that's trying to wow everybody. And they over-render the entire scene.
Yeah, Mulele had that complaint about New Avengers, as I recall.
Okay.
Several months ago when we talked about that.
He didn't like any of the artwork with New Avengers. He didn't even like the penciler, his choices with the size of the characters in there.
Well, yeah, that was another issue. But yeah, I remember him saying lately. Well, remember we were talking about a couple different artists there because New Avengers is kind of rotated artists, and he liked one better than the other, but the one that he liked, he still felt like the coloring was screwing it up, as I recall. But yeah, these two pictures of Dead Man, or two differently colored versions. The first one, it has kind of a gradient at the bottom. Now it looks like he's inside something. I don't quite understand this picture. Look, he's
behind glass, maybe.
Yeah, so
it looks like he's looking out of a window, perhaps.
Yeah, in the one that it calls overly rendered, down towards his legs, the color changes to kind of a greenish blue.
I think the saturation fades as it goes from the top to the bottom.
It's kind of a gradient. Whereas the one that these writers like better, it just stays red. It's his costume color, and
the background stays black.
There's no green blue, no gradient at all.
And they spend a lot of time in that first panel trying to render and shadow and make the character look 3D. When the penciling and the inking is really flat. So it competes with the style that was determined by the artist originally. So even if you look at his face, there's like 7 different shades of gray used in the one that's over rendered. However, in the face that they liked, there's white, there's gray, and there's black.
Yeah.
So it's got some distinction to give it some form, but it's not, let's try to make this into the Mona Lisa. They had webs on the windows. In the second one, it's all gray. In the next one, it's kind of a greenish gray, and it's got several layers of gradient building up towards the center, and it really doesn't look like webs.
These are spider webs? I couldn't really tell.
They look like cobwebs, I think.
I couldn't really tell in either one. Yeah.
I look at a lot of new novel work, so
Okay, that makes sense. That's what that is. Yeah, maybe I guess that must be a window he's looking out of.
Yeah, that looks like it.
My first impression was that it was some kind of a round glass tube or something. But
on the page facing it, they have another section where they're talking about a different concept, a concept they're calling selective realism, and they have 3 panels of The Flash from JLA 102, Pencils and Inks by Ron Garning. And in this section, they're talking about how you've got to be able to choose, okay, what am I going to make look realistic, and what am I going to make not so realistic to make the characters stand out? What's more important in the panel? Is it more important that all the colors look accurate and realistic for every item on the page, and that everything is sharp, or do I have the ability to kind of set things off by changing the realism based on what I'm trying to get across with this scene? And here, one section says the colorist's job is to aid the eye by sublimating the background or less important aspects in a panel. Because of the relatively short time frame that a comics reader's eye stays on a single panel, the colorist must help to direct the eye to the most pertinent information. By using color principles such as a complementary color, color temperature, intensity, and value, a colorist can subliminally edit out all the extraneous information. Now, everything they just mentioned, it sounds very technical, but it is all covered in the previous pages of the book. So by the time that you're reading that page, you already know what they're talking about with value and saturation and complementary colors. There's sections on focus, depth, aerial perspective, what you should do with the coloring there. First 2 chapters are dealing with the basics. And then the third chapter actually gets into application.
So those 3 panels of Flash, the first one had, I'm not sure what that background is supposed to be.
I think it's supposed to be in front of a computer or something?
Like the Bat computer, lots of flashing lights on it or something. But the first one has a really colorful background. Whatever it is in the background has been colored in purple and yellow and green.
Orange and green. I think this applies to it. It says if you were to pick background colors randomly or chosen solely because they're nice or pleasing, regardless of their appropriateness to the scene, you're probably going to end up with a confusing panel. And that's, I believe, their example of a confusing panel.
Yeah, that's what they go on to say here, it looks like. In the first illustration at left, the background has been colored with bright, vibrant colors, which draws the reader's attention away from the foreground figure. Panel 2, where it's all colored in kind of a dark green-gray, shows a much more subdued background color scheme, which allows the flash to rightfully remain the focus of the panel. The last panel demonstrates how the human eye sees panel number 2, holding the reader's attention on the flash, while almost ignoring the much less important background. So that third one, the background is almost invisible. It's kind of faded out. So that they're saying that's not how you should actually do it, but how they will be perceived if you color the background more subtly.
And I think, as far as the color theory is concerned, the reason why they've chosen this grayish green is it's actually a complement of red, which is primary color of the Flash's costume. Mm-hmm. So it does make him pop out a little bit more.
Yeah.
And it sets it more in the background because the saturation is a little bit less than the colors on his costume, making his costume kind of come forward a little bit more. So as far as the color is concerned, they go in depth into chapter 1 is going into what they used to do with coloring, and how a lot of times it wasn't actually even an artist who were coloring the comic books at the time.
Oh, who was it? Like somebody who did the printing, or
somebody about to go to the printing press. They would have the color key, and they would just kind of, well, Batman is blue, black, and gray. So
I think
blue, black, and gray.
The artist or the editor might tell the printer what color they wanted it. I know that was the story why the Hulk was gray originally and then changed to green, because the gray wasn't coming out very good in printing. And so Stan Lee or whoever just said, okay, make him green. Or
right. That's what it was. But usually at the publishers, not the printers area, they would have, the publisher would sometimes have a person doing a double duty. They would have another job. There would be maybe an assistant editor, and then they would say, okay, you're going to be the colorist on this book. And what the colorist would do, they would take this, they have an example on page 12, this key of 63 different colors, and they would just start to mark up a photocopy of the artwork. And they would turn the photocopy in with either they've colored in with markers and given the numbers of the colors on that key, or they could have just put in the key numbers according to the sections that were going to be colored, and they turn that in with the artwork to be reproduced together. And they have an example of the 3 pages. They have a inked page with no colors. They have the finished inked page, and then they have the color key or the color guide that would have been made by the person at the publishing section.
Let me see this. Okay, yeah, they're around the edges of the page. There are codes for the colors written in and lines pointing to where that color should be.
Which does explain why, if you look at a lot of older comics, before digital technology really came to the forefront, every once in a while you would see a section that you looked at it and you were going, why in the hell did they color that color? It doesn't even fit in. And the last panel was white. Now it's pink. What's going on? And it was probably simply because either the person who was determined to be the colorist at that time missed that one section to tell the printer what was going to be there, or there was a mistake by the printer putting that number. You've got a whole lot more in the process here than what we use now. You have one person that sits down at a computer and they can determine what colors go into each block of area, each patch that will require the color. And so it's that one person's responsibility of going through and making sure that I've colored everything the same all the way through. Adding more people into the mix sometimes causes problems.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's better,
Mm-hmm.
but more likely to miss stuff, I think. So, chapter 1, they go into printing basics, why they were choosing from this color key, CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, how that's used as the four colors to print up almost any color in a common
Mm-hmm.
printing press,
Yeah.
offset prints. Like in magazines, posters, usually it's all four color stuff.
Yeah.
Chapter 2, the principles of color. They talk about hue, complementary colors, value, intensity, and color temperature. Chapter 3 is the section that had the magnolia example and the flash example, where you're actually applying those theory principles so that you can tell the story better. And it's called storytelling with color. Chapter 4 is... There's no chapter 4.
It goes into part 2.
This is a second part that goes beyond the theory and actually into computer techniques that you would use. And they're using Photoshop to do their coloring.
On a Mac, of course.
There it is. Chapter
and
4 is
so chapter 4 is what you get into after part 2 starts.
computers and comic book coloring. And then I think as soon as this is getting started with coloring, Chapter 5. So it's talking about cleanup, making sure that your inks are good, how to use the lasso tool. So actually stuff that you would be able to sit down and use from Photoshop.
Mm-hmm.
Chapter 6, a more in-depth look at applying color. General keystrokes and shortcuts. Once again, into the hands-on of the craft.
What version of Photoshop are they using?
It looks like a newer version. It's
Yeah,
probably
couldn't be
Photoshop
too
7.
old if there's that flash was from a 2004 issue. So
It looks like Photoshop 7 maybe. Could be CS. Let me see.
by the way, while he's looking for that, just to remind you that we are sponsored by Comics Now. Comics Now has a mail subscription service. You can get 35% off all your new comics. So check out comicsnow.com. And, of course, there's a link from our site at globalcomics.net. And I haven't gotten a definitive answer yet on special discounts on comics that we talk about on the podcast. But watch globalcomics.net. Hopefully we'll have something on that.
Okay, it says they're using Photoshop 7 in this example. Photoshop has since moved on to CS and CS2.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're anticipating a release of CS3 early next year that integrates some other paintbrushes, and they just added in the Macromedia software into it, like Flash and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So that covers...
Sounds interesting to me because, I mean, of course, I'm coloring Spider-Hag in Photoshop, and I've been doing that for 3 years and have figured out some things about it. Been using some gradients, but I'm sure there's a lot there that I don't even know about.
So you want to read this thing?
Yeah.
And it talks about skin tones. Okay.
Ooh, Powerpuff Girls.
Yep. Coloring styles. Coloring covers. The traps of computer coloring. Which I think more people should read. I already see some of the errors in it.
What are the traps?
It's easy to do special effects and add filters and everything.
Uh-huh.
And sometimes it hurts the story.
Mm.
So some people... effects to avoid. Here are some awful things that you can do with a computer that you probably shouldn't. Import your photographs. Lens flare and blur filters. Using too many filters. Color holds. What's a color hold? A color hold is when you change a selected area of black line work into a color. This can be a very effective storytelling technique when coloring an explosion or fire or water or neon signs or energy crackles. But if you're tempted to turn the line work of everyday objects into a different color simply because it'll look cool, don't. Refer back to page 52 for specific instructions for doing color holds on your computer. Color holds can be a very valuable asset to your coloring, but only if you learn how and when to use them properly. And that's kind of true with almost any of the special effects that could be out there. And it says special care when adding special effects on page 77. Chapter 9, from computer to printed page. So they take you through the process of realizing that what you've colored on your computer may actually end up different once it goes to the printer. So you have to make sure your monitor is calibrated. You have to think about the paper stock, because the paper is going to have an effect on the colors. RGB to CMYK, that's what I was talking about.
Yeah.
And personal printers. And then chapter 10 is showing your work. Part 3 actually gets into lettering. And they go into a lot of detail, tools and material, how to do it by hand. And then later, they get into the theory of what kind of balloons you should use and how you should apply the balloons, how you should do special sound effects and that kind of stuff. And then, just like they did in the first part, once they go over all the techniques and the theory, chapter 17 is advanced techniques. Then they'll get into the how to do it on the computer, which is part 4.
We talked a little bit about that a while back. Last time we talked about when Jay Bennett had some questions about lettering and so forth. Jay Bennett, who does Citizens of Ivywood, you can see some of that on globalcomics.net. But yeah, I remember we mentioned the Comic Craft fonts at that time, which is what I'm using for Spider Hag.
Okay. And Comic Craft they do have a book on how to letter, but I don't like it as much as I like the DC book. It doesn't really get into as much theory, and some of the stuff is just it seems like a commercial for
Comic Craft fonts.
The fonts, yeah. Where DC doesn't really sell fonts. And the book, it's a great value, I think, because of all the information that's contained in it. And the cover price is $19.95, but I got it for much less than that on Amazon. I think I got it for like $12.95 on Amazon. Yeah, or if Comics Now sells it, maybe
if it's published by DC, you can probably get it from them. And they pretty much any trade paperback that's still in print they can get.
It's color all the way throughout. All the illustrations are straight from comic books, the DC comic books, with all the artists that you would know. I see on the cover they have, these are examples that are actually in the book. They have a Tim Sale Batman, they have an Adam Hughes Wonder Woman, and I don't know who did the Superman.
Batman.
No, I don't know who did the Superman. I know Tim Sale did the Batman.
Tim Sale did Batman,
Yeah.
okay. I wonder if
But it's not like they just kind of got some crappy artist to illustrate their
third
book.
Stringer. Yeah.
They actually took panels from the real comic books that are out there, or covers. Adam Hughes is a cover. He mostly does covers nowadays. One of the more famous Wonder Woman covers. That's beautiful work.
Yeah, I don't see anything about. Oh, here, let's see. Front cover illustrations: Darwin Cook, that must have been the Superman. Adam Hughes and Tim Sale. Okay.
Great book if you're thinking about coloring your own comics.
Okay. The DC Comics Guide to Coloring and Lettering Comics.
Or lettering your own comics. I recommend picking it up.
Okay. Oh, by the way, I got an email from Mulele yesterday.
You did?
He said San Diego was great. He had a great time, but he's just hoping he can actually make some money pretty soon.
San Diego, as far as the comic?
Yeah, he was at the con. He didn't elaborate on what he did there, but I told him that I had been meaning to ask him if he could give us some run down some report on what he did there, and I haven't heard back from him. But
he said he was going to try and enjoy it more this time.
Well, by actually attending, instead of drawing in the hotel room. Yeah. Well, it sounded like he succeeded at that.
I had to open up the windows because he was just so intensely into his artwork that the room started to smell funny. Because he pretty much, like, he barely slept while he was there, too.
Wow.
He was working so hard on,
and
I
with
think it was
jet
like
lag.
9 pages. Yeah.
Jet lag and then
they
not
just
sleeping.
stayed up all hours of the night trying to get those pages perfect so that he could turn them in.
Wow.
And then the people that we were talking about this great book with, they did them wrong.
DC. Well, like we said last time, it may have had to do more with what the subject matter of what he drew, but
right.
I don't know. Anyway, well, if you have any comments, questions, books you'd like to hear us talk about, so forth, you can write to us at podcast@globalcomics.net. So that'll do it for this time. So we'll see you next week on Deconstructing Comics. I'm Tim.
And I'm Brandon.
See you.
Got kind of an echo there with my voice.
Omlade no toyeta no tugangra mwamuro ya mekumu eyimbeli minakama oyugeli limingambere me moto mwanya yele ya mina mami moto tuwa Ayere wo